this computer. Okay, I think that means that we are recording. Brilliant. So, hi, Elaine. Thank you so much for making time to chat with me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Really, always a pleasure to chat with you, Holly.
It's so good to see you. I'm really excited to do this. This is our sort of Azalea first podcast or interview, whatever we want to call it. But I'm really grateful that we get to do it with you. So thank you so much for making the time. So I'm going to quickly introduce you and then we'll head into some questions. So everybody, welcome. This is Elaine Storkey and I am Holly Stone. I'm the Encompass Director at Azalea and I have the privilege of chatting to Elaine today to introduce you to her. So Elaine has lectured across the world, including in Haiti, India, Nepal and Turkey. And she is a prominent feminist evangelical and her writings have brought a biblical perspective to the feminist movement. She is passionate about highlighting the impact of climate change, global poverty, and sexual violence on women. Philosopher, sociologist, and theologian, as well as wife, mum, and granny. Now, are you granny or are you grandma? What do you go by?
I'm nanny, actually.
Are you your nanny? Okay, there we go. And Elaine was born and raised in the UK and went on to travel the world, making connections with all whom she met. In fact, Elaine continues to travel the world since I first met her in Wisconsin in the States only last year for a global anti-sex trafficking conference. Elaine is known for her lecturing at institutions such as Oxford University, as well as other universities across the globe. For her writing of articles and authoring books, her latest being Meeting God in Matthew. Her broadcasting for the BBC, as well as being involved in many documentaries, arts, news, and current affairs programmes. In 1997, she became president of Tear Fund, a Christian relief and development charity, and has since been involved in monitoring aid, relief, and advocacy work in countries of the global south. And this presidency spanned 17 years. Elaine is a wonderful balance of practitioner and academic. She writes and speaks from a place of experience and relationship, which has given her such a depth of understanding about the things she cares about and has been exposed to. So we are very, very privileged at Azalea to have Elaine as our patron. And so for this reason and all of the above, Elaine, I'm so excited to chat to you so that we can introduce you properly to our supporters. So thank you so much for making the time to chat to me today.
Oh, it's such a joy.
Now, first things first, how did you initially learn about Azalea? What is the link there?
Well, I've been very interested in the whole issue of prostitution and felt it was a burden on so many women across the world. And many years ago, I was part of a small group in the UK that was looking at how we could stand alongside women who were working on the street and give them, help them in whatever practical and emotional, but also spiritual way we could. And then I came across Lauren Bethel, who had this big international organization, the International Christian Alliance on Prostitution. And she and I became great friends, and I threw my weight in with that. And then she said, but you realize that Azalea is doing all the work that you really need to get involved with in England. And at that stage, I had heard about Azalea. You were on my list, as it were, of incredibly good and wonderful organizations, but I hadn't made any kind of inroads into a relationship with you. I knew about Ruth and everything else. And so I think that finally, when we all got together in Wisconsin, it was very, very clear to me that this is where I suppose my energy ought to lie, rather than just trying to help people in Canada and in the Netherlands and all the rest of it. Why not on my own doorstep? So that's how I first got hold of the information I needed. And then coming to your place and looking around and seeing what facilities you've got for the women. And more than that, just knowing your heart for those women and knowing a lot about the pain it takes. I've been to safe houses up and down the country run by groups who want to make the world a safer place for women in prostitution. And I know how discouraging the work is as well. But you were not discouraged. You were all kind of buoyant and full of hope and full of joy. And that was such a delightful surprise to me. And so that's how I've got to know you. And I really want to carry on working with you as much as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're so thrilled to have you on board, and it was so great to see you, because we had our 15th birthday party, didn't we, and you were able to come to that, which was great. The building all dressed
It's
up,
a
and
real birthday party.
yeah, 15 years of work that Azalea has been doing, so it was great to celebrate, and so good that you could come along. So, obviously, a big proportion of the work that you do is about understanding, exposing, and eliminating violence against women in all sorts of different cultures and contexts. You know, we've already talked about a few of the countries that you've been to, but I imagine the list just goes on and on and on. So, what was it that sparked your initial passion for this vital area of work?
I think it started a lot earlier than I realized. I mean, I was a young bride, probably, I think I was pregnant when a woman who edited a women's magazine, and it was a Christian women's magazine, sent me a whole load of answers to a questionnaire she'd run in the magazine as to what domestic violence might be like. And she'd foolishly asked anybody who wanted to fill in this questionnaire to fill it in and send it to her by post at this address. And she got something like 700 replies. I mean, it was unbelievable. And she bundled them all in an envelope and sent them to me. And I said, "Oh, sure, I'll read them tonight." And she wanted a sociologist, I'm a sociologist, to cast her eye over them and write a report up. And it sounded like a very academic thing to do. And then I started reading this, and it was horrendous, just realizing what some women went through in relationships, in close, intimate relationships. It was such a shock. Because I'd never myself experienced anything like it, and I knew nothing of it. So for me, that was a very late intrusion into the reality of violence against women and how it can happen even in the most intimate circumstances. And then since then, I became more and more interested in women who are driven into prostitution for whatever reason, whether it's their background or whether it's drugs, whatever the reason, as to why they got there and what hope there is for them. And then finally, it was actually when I went to Congo with Tear Fund and saw rape as a weapon of war, women being raped because they were women, because they could be raped by the warring enemies and so on, that I realized that something had to be done about it. So all I can do is talk and write and kind of support people who are working in these areas. So that's what I started to do. I started to write books. I've got one somewhere here. Scars Across Humanity.
Yeah,
I think
I've
it's
heard about this one.
and that took me 8 years to write.
Wow.
And the reason it took me so long is I kept putting the stories aside because they were so painful. I just couldn't carry on reading what I was writing, and I couldn't read the notes that I'd written in encounters with other women, and I couldn't bear the memories. So I had to keep putting it aside, and I thought, this is never going to get written. But then I bumped into a publisher at a dinner, and he said, "Tell me you're writing an interesting book." So send me a few chapters. So I sent him a few chapters, and he phoned straight away and said, "This book has to be published, Elaine. Finish it quickly, and we'll put it out for you." So that's how it all happened, and then it got out. Yeah, and then it went into an American edition and all the rest of it. Got a prize in America, actually. So I've been interested in all of these areas, and I've written other books. You mentioned Meeting God in Matthew.
Oh, I've got
That's
one looking here.
an exposition of you've got your own copy of Matthew's Gospel, and I think when you read it as a woman, you read a lot more that very often men miss, because there's an awful lot there about what's happening to women in first century that's very pertinent to us today. And then the other book that's relevant is my Daisy. I can't even get it. Is Women in a Patriarchal World.
Yeah.
And that's the story of all women in the scriptures, the Bible, the Old and New Testament, who had to face challenges because they were women and because of the male dominance of society, and how they faced these challenges and what God did through them and so on. So I write, and writing is a way actually of communicating what is really important to me and what I think is important to God, and the implications of the gospel, how we should be relating as Christians to these areas of life. And it's an enormous, both a privilege and a passion to be involved in this.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, and you can testify to it, with having traveled across so many places, meeting so many people in so many different cultures. There's things that can look different about violence against women, but fundamentally it is the same, and it is such a global problem in every country, in every community. Violence against women is something that we all need to be aware of and fight against. And so we've got a project here called PAST, which stands for People Against Sex Trafficking, and we recently changed it to that because it was last because it was Luton against sex trafficking, but actually we've realised that it's not just a problem, and it's not something we've just realised, but we don't want to communicate it as this is a problem in Luton, because it's not a problem with Luton. It's a problem across the world, no matter where you are, no matter which area you live in. Violence against women, sex trafficking, it's a problem globally. Yeah, thank you for
And
sharing.
usually it's integrated with other things as well, because when I was writing that book on Scars Across Humanity, I asked myself the question, if you take the idea of a global woman, where in her life cycle is violence likely to occur? And I suddenly realized with horror, the answer is all the way through, starting in the womb. And you start with, sex selective abortion, how in India and China, they don't want little girls, they only want boys. And so they abort girls. And it's a terrific issue. And then female genital mutilation and child brides, which is just another name for child abuse. And then honor killings and of course, prostitution and trafficking. The whole area of sex trafficking is massive, as well as rape and intimate partner violence and all of the other things. So it's in every culture, as you say, and very often it's actually in the very life of that culture. It's part of the traditions of that culture, like FGM, female genital mutilation. Nobody benefits from it at all, and yet it's something that's barbaric, carried out on little girls' bodies. In order to cut off their genitalia so they will never have sexual excitement. I mean, it's horrendous what goes on. And once your eyes are open to it, you can't close them anymore. That's the difference. You can't close them. Once you've seen it and seen the effects of these things on people's lives, once you've heard their stories, you're a different person. Which is why the work you're doing is so very important, because you're hearing the stories all the time and you're meeting the people.
Yeah, it's definitely a privilege, for sure. But like you said, it's stuff that you never forget. It really, really stays with you. But it is such a privilege. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, by the sounds of things, even just reading through the sorts of things that you've done throughout your career, there's so many things to refer to. You've had such an amazing array of different roles over the years, with dominant sort of threads going through all of them. But I wanted to ask, do you have a role that has been particularly meaningful to you, that has been sort of a favourite role that you've perhaps enjoyed the most, or felt was, I don't know, most fruitful or meaningful to you? Yeah, I know it's hard to pick often, because I imagine every role is different in so many ways, and you get to meet different people, and there's all sorts of pros and cons. But is there one that that you really enjoyed that time?
This is going to sound a bit wet, but yeah, I loved being a mother.
Well, there you go.
I just absolutely adored it when because I've been an academic all my life up to that point, and we got married, and then I had an operation and I lost half my kind of reproductive system. I lost a tube and an ovary and a fallopian tube and all the rest of it. And so the surgeon said, if you want to have children, I'd just quit academia for a few months and try now. So I said to Alan, do we want to have children? And he said, yeah. So we did. We had 3 sons, all boys, quite quickly, 3 of them on one fallopian tube and one ovary.
Wow. Yeah.
And actually, when I became a mother, it just changed everything. I suddenly realized that, there's something so incredibly important about this tiny, completely defenseless offspring. So I'm sure that all mothers that are listening to this will recognize that becomes your entire life for a while. And so that role was so significant to me. It changed me completely. And of course, it teaches you your own vulnerability, because you're never more vulnerable than when you love a defenseless person or a vulnerable person, because your fears are always for that person. And you can be hurt by that person being hurt and all the rest of it. So it's a very important relational experience. But yeah, I love it. And then it was quite easy fitting things in with the family, because the boys were so sweet. They really didn't mind. And I took a job with the Open University that allowed me to work from home. And these were the days long before COVID. And we had set times when people may phone me, and if they phone me outside those times, our eldest son used to answer the phone and say, "No, these are not mummy's times for you. You'll have to phone another
Good on
time."
him.
He
That's
was
so
an
good.
excellent secretary.
Yeah, he was trained well with those boundaries. And what sort of period, so with your career, when was it that you had children? Or where were you up to before you had your three sons?
Well, I was already teaching in academia. I was already teaching in universities. And I think had got my second job in a university up in Scotland, in Stirling. I'd been in Oxford before, and then I got married and joined down in Stirling. So I was into a strong university career, and then I took 6 years out completely, and then went slowly back to part-time, and didn't go back full-time until my youngest son was in secondary school. But during that time, actually, I think it was God's provision for me, because I did so many other things as well as just being an academic. Whereas if I hadn't had children, and if I had just stayed in academia, I would have been single-mindedly teaching philosophy in some university department. And life would not have been anything like as exciting as it has been, nor would I have learned as much. I've learned so much just by doing what I've done. And that's been a huge privilege. So, yeah.
It's amazing. Also so encouraging, because even having that time out, and obviously you went part-time for a while before you went back full-time, and still just the incredible amount that you've been able to do with all
Yeah.
the other years is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
So that's amazing to hear.
Well,
So
the nice thing is I never felt driven to apply for jobs. So I always prayed, Lord, if you want me to do something, just let somebody ask me. And then let me weigh it up, because the whole tedium of applying for a job and filling
yeah,
in forms and going to interviews, I really couldn't face all of that stuff. And nearly all the jobs I've had, well, really all the jobs I have had, have just been people asking me to do them. And consequently, it's taken, yeah, that is a privilege. Come on. I mean, it's taken all that time off your back searching around. And I'm just very grateful for that.
no, absolutely. That's a huge blessing. Really cool. Yeah. And you can definitely see God's hand in that as well, can't you? Just allowing him to
Absolutely.
be in
Yeah.
complete control of
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So good. And obviously, you mentioned earlier about just the relationships that you've been able to build and the stories that you've heard, and those things that you can't unhear, especially from people when you have a relationship with them. And I think it can be sometimes with people that you've just met for the first time and they share their story with you. I don't think actually you need to have a relationship with somebody for their story to be that memorable. Can you sort of, I mean, again, I'm sure it's hard to pick one because you'll have met so many people. Is there somebody who you can recall who has had a real impact on you personally and professionally? So that, I guess, could be another academic, for example, but it could also be one of the women that you've chatted to and shared their story, or somebody who runs an organization who you were particularly inspired by. It could be anybody who's sort of that one
There,
person.
there, are, there are lots of them, Holly. I mean, it's quite hard to pick one out. But if I were to pick, I'd pick two out. One would be a woman called Kathy Kroger, who is was a very upper class American woman, an academic, a classical scholar, and so on, but suddenly got a real urge for violence against women and women in pain and so on. And she just inspired me so much, because she came out of her protected background and faced an awful lot just in developing this work. But the one I would focus on most of all is Lynn Lucy, who married a Congolese surgeon and set up this healing center in Congo. And her life, wherever there was trouble, wherever there was war, carnage, volcanoes, very often kind of genocides, she and Joe, her husband, we call him Joe, but his name's Kasareka, would be there actually doing the healing and being God's presence in that area. And she was an absolutely amazing woman. And one of her great missions was to stop women from needing to go into prostitution just because they'd been raped and violated, because that was quite a common pattern, that you'd find that a raped woman would be thrown out by her family, including her husband very often, because she was now spoiled goods. How would she earn a living? And prostitution was a way in which she could earn a living. So Lynn was absolutely determined to stop that chain, to break that link. And her love and her outreach to women who had been violated just inspired me so much. She was absolutely amazing. She gave everything she had. And the people I met through her, the people who came into Heal Africa, into the hospital, and their stories, and the women for whom it was quite normal to be raped, quite normal to have this violation going on, but they bore the scars not just in their bodies, but really in their hearts and minds and emotions. And could they trust anybody? And it was all of that taught me so much, and it reached out, I suppose, to my own heart and my own emotions. And you just thank God for their resilience, the way that they did come around, the way that they themselves then went back into the areas that they'd been violated in and worked with other women. And it just is amazing. It's a lovely story.
Yeah, it sounds it. It sounds it. And I think, is this the lady that you refer to? There's a bit of an article on your website.
Probably, yes.
I think I recognize her name. So were you living with them? Did you stay with them for long, or did you visit?
Yes, I stayed with them in Goma, in Congo, in the hospital. But of course, she died of cancer far too early. And her husband, her widow, comes every year and stays with us and finds out how, because I'm writing a manuscript about them both at the moment, finds out how it's going and just updates me into what they're doing. And they are still doing an amazing work of God in the middle of still a traumatic country, terribly war-torn country. And they've been celebrated all over the world. And so their witness is amazing. And it has so much integrity to it. Whatever it costs, they're going to pay the price. And it takes your breath away, really. Lynn gave her life to Congo, where she could have been an academic and an artist. She was a dramatist. She was a director of a theatre company and all the rest of it. But she gave her life to damaged women in Congo.
She sounds like an incredibly inspiring woman.
He was.
Yeah, and I can imagine it's another one of those books that's going to take you a while to write.
It's taking forever.
Is it? Yeah, it sounds like there's going to be a lot to cover with that one. Oh wow, yeah, it is. It can be so breathtaking, can't it, when you meet those people, and yeah, you just can't quite believe the strength that God's given them to carry on with it. Brilliant.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, everything about Lynn was kind of spirit directed. Everything was given back to God all the time, constantly. And how they used their money, where they got their money from, how they spent their time in the day, whom they related to, and where they looked for help. Everything. Some incredible decisions. She worked for years with HIV/AIDS patients as well, because they were infected often by soldiers who had raped them, and sometimes in prostitution. So there's every area of damaged women's lives she was involved in some way or another.
Amazing. What a phenomenal woman. Well, thank you for sharing about her. Okay, next, not about a person, but about, I guess, a momentous sort of occasion in your career. So I feel like in this area of work, sometimes you can feel like you're fighting a losing battle, shall we say. You can sometimes feel a bit sort of overwhelmed by the darkness and the heaviness of the things that happen in the world and the things that we hear and see. And yeah, sometimes, I mean, on one hand, you can have those sort of situations where it feels like you've seen something be really fruitful or really successful quite quickly. Other times you're working and really pushing and fighting, and eventually you get to see the fruit of it. Sometimes we don't, sometimes we do. But do you have sort of a moment in your career where you thought, gosh, I fought really hard for this and it's amazing to see the fruit of it?
It's a difficult question to answer that, because I can't remember fighting terribly hard for many things. Things have come quite easy in many ways. The things I've fought hard for have usually been with other people and involved in their lives. I think I have fought hard for women to have more space in society, in the church, and in releasing their gifts, because God has gifted women in so many different ways. So yeah, I fought with other people about that, and there's been lots and lots of successes, sometimes very, very unexpected successes. So we had a group that, and a lot from their political, and it would bore your listeners to listen to too much of this political stuff, but there's something called the Istanbul Convention, which countries of Europe have signed, including the UK. But you also have to ratify a convention, which means you have to put money where your mouth is. You've got to back it up with resources. Now, the Istanbul Convention says we will not tolerate violence against women. And no form of violence against women. And that actually implicitly includes violence against women who are prostituted. So Britain has signed this, but it has not ratified it. It hasn't put any resources into organizations that support women or that look after women or whatever, except what it's been forced to do by its own charter. So we had a small group. Well, I go around talking about the Istanbul Convention for years, and then this young woman who was only in her 20s came up to me and said, "So Elaine, what are you going to do about it?" Oh, I said, "I don't do things, I just talk." So she said, "That's useless." so I said, "But I'm no good at campaigning. I'm not that kind of person." So then I thought a minute and said, "But actually, Robin, you're a brilliant campaigner. Why don't you do something about it?" And she looked at me and said, "Okay, if you won't, I will." And she did. She got a group together on the Istanbul Convention for the government to ratify it. She then reached out beyond the Christian community. She reached out into other faith communities, into humanitarian communities. She got a private member to make a private member's motion in Parliament, and it got through to third reading, and actually it's still there. It eventually, when it got through, the bill requires the British government to ratify the Istanbul Convention. And unfortunately, it was the same time as Brexit came. So suddenly government closed down, it was not done. And then you had this whole kind of stuff over people changing governments. We had a succession of prime ministers. So it's still there, it still hasn't been done. But the way in which out of nowhere, this young woman got a whole campaign right through the system makes you realize that God wanted this to happen and actually made the facilities there for it to happen. The idea that that private member's motion should get through 3 parliamentary hearings is unheard of. That never happens. And they tried to talk it down at the 3rd hearing. You had all the opponents who didn't want this to be signed, to be ratified, coming out in force. And one by one, they just kind of fell, as it were, and it got through. So it shows that when people are really determined, and when they do have the Spirit of God, and when they have what God has laid on their heart, they can bring wonders out of almost nothing. But for me, those experiences have really been looking at other people enjoying them. I mean, mine have been very, very ad hoc, very odd. So, I mean, I'll tell you one little story. So I was being given an honorary doctorate by a university, I won't name it, but and it was in the middle of February, was a graduation, and it was really, really frozen, and the roads were awful, and I had to drive hundreds of miles to do this. But I thought it's the only polite thing to do is to turn up for your doctorate. So I drove all this way, got there in time, robed up, did everything right, sank down next to the person who is one of the senior tutors in one of the departments, and was so relieved. And then she gave me the program. She said, "We're so glad to have you, Dr. Storkey. It's wonderful to be here, blah, blah, usual thing." And I read the program. And then I saw at the end of the program, it said, "And then an honorary doctorate will be awarded to Dr. Elaine Storkey for blah, blah, blah. And then she will address the as kind of group." She will address the graduation on behalf of all the graduates. And I stared at this and I said, what's this?" to the woman sitting next to me. She said, "Oh, 15, 20 minutes, no more than 20 minutes, 18 minutes will be fine." And I thought, 18 minutes, so about 3,000 people in this auditorium, 18 minutes of unscripted talk for 3,000 people. I mean, I went cold all over. I nearly bolted for the door.
Yeah,
But
I would have.
and I just started praying, "Lord, just tell me what to say. I have no idea what to say for 18 minutes. And then it was like lights were switched on. Every time some people went up to get their degree, God said something to me. And as a department was closing, and you could see the pain in their faces as they were getting their degree, and their tutors were hugging them, but that department was going to be closed down, and those jobs were going to be finished, and those degrees really were the last degrees ever to be awarded there. And all kinds of things were going on that I would not normally have noticed, but God had actually was starting to tell me what I should be saying. And so it was easy. When I got up, it was so easy to say it. I mean, it was just, I went into the whole issue of time, that we are here together in a unique moment. This is a unique time for everybody in this auditorium. We will never be together again like this. This is unique. And then taking that sense of uniqueness of time and uniqueness of moments, and what special moments are, and what I'd observed in the people coming for graduation, how these were unique for them in all kinds of different ways. And then looking at history and the uniqueness of time in history, and how it all ultimately focuses on one man on a cross saying, "It is finished." And that's the time that time and eternity meet together, and it becomes fused into reality, into our history. We even date our history from that time. And so we were going into all of these things, and I ended with and I'd also drawn on the university motto, which happened to be a Christian motto, and kept placing that. Yeah, I finished with a St. Anselm's prayer. "Lord, you've made us for yourselves, and our hearts are restless till we find their rest in you." And so I said to the graduates, so go out, not with restless hearts, looking for rest in something in the creation, but find your rest in God, and know peace in your walk and success in everything you do. And then I realized I'd just preached a sermon. And suddenly thought, oh, crumbs, what do I do now? And nobody said anything. It was complete silence. And then this mace bearer came and escorted me back to my seat. And as I was reaching the top of the steps and looking at the Vice Chancellor's stunned face, completely stunned, somebody in the auditorium stood up and started to clap. And then the entire auditorium stood up and clapped. And it just went on. The applause went on. And it was not because my speech had been brilliant. It wasn't brilliant. It was because somehow or another, God had touched them and spoken to them at a different level, not a clever level, not a kind of, nothing kind of funny or silly, but at a level at which they weren't used to being spoken at. And I think that for me was an extraordinary moment. I mean, it was very significant, because you can see, even when you're at your wit's end, even when you've got nothing to offer people, even when you don't know what to do next, God can actually just take you and use you and communicate to people so that they are receiving what God wants to receive from them. God wants them to receive from him. And that gives me huge confidence. So I'm out of my comfort zone ever so often now, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
It sounds like you thrive.
Well, God is there. God is always bigger than one's comfort zone.
Yeah, and sometimes freestyling is clearly the way to do it.
Yes. Yeah.
Gosh, that must have been so moving to have sort of everybody, and like you said, not standing to applaud the speech as such, although I'm sure, you know, they were inspired by the speech, but just how God had moved them through what you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, quite an emotional moment. So cool. Okay, I think I have one and a couple more questions. I'm just having a look to see because I could ask you so many. Um,
Hmm.
but I think what I'll do, if it's okay, is move on to a question about your book. So, Meeting God in Matthew. Um, so this book was published in 2022, so only last year. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So were you writing that during COVID?
Oh, I was, yes. Well, bits and pieces during COVID. I mean, it took a while for me to say yes to it because I thought other people should be writing on biblical texts, but because they'd already advertised it as being written when it wasn't, they got orders for it. Then I had to had to write it, and actually, I was glad I did because God spoke to me through that preparation as much as any other time in my life, really. Mm.
No, it's amazing. It's a fantastic book. And I wanted to talk a little bit about in chapter 3, you talk about kingdom relationships. And so relationships is something that at Azalea we harp on about day and night. You know, we have our frontline training, which we invite people who are interested in Azalea to come and explore, and they'll come for 3, I think we're 4 days now because we have sort of a practical day as well. So they come for 4 days, and throughout every section that we teach on in those days, we are referring to relationship and how important and powerful relationship is, and how healing relationship is as well. And you talk about 3 key elements to achieve these kind of kingdom relationships in the book, and those are letting go of worry, being childlike, and showing forgiveness. And as I've said, relationship is something that we don't stop talking about, and we're always pointing to Jesus and saying, you know, he is the key example of how to be in relationship. He came to this earth to be in relationship with us and teach us about what relationship should look like. And so we're always trying to model this to the guests, to each other. And I guess reading through that section of your book, and you say it in the book as well about how difficult these 3 things can be, especially with forgiveness. You say that forgiveness and reconciliation remains a hugely challenging area for human beings. And you know, the other areas as well, remaining childlike and letting go of worry. And I think especially in this area of work, those 3 things in particular can be so difficult because, for example, with letting go of worry, you know, we have team members that go home at the end of a nighttime drop in or after outreach, and they have no idea if that person that they've just spoken to is going to be alive in the morning, or if they're going to have been trafficked, you know, to a completely different country, whether we're going to see them again, whether we're going to be able to even speak to them again over the phone. And I think naturally with this area of work, and you'll know all about it and have met so many people who know all about it, there can be an overwhelming sense of sort of anxious thoughts about things that could happen, about things that have happened. And yeah, so I guess that anxiety and letting that go, giving it to God and letting go of that worry can be a very difficult thing. And again, being childlike, I guess the darkness and the heaviness of the things that we see in here, and it's secondhand, you know, people talk about secondary trauma and how even just hearing what somebody has been through can traumatize you as somebody who's walking with somebody else who has been through that. And the darkness of that can be quite overwhelming again, and perhaps reduce somebody's ability to remain childlike. I think in the book you talk about sort of in the New Testament the qualities that Jesus talks about as remaining childlike, and about trust of a child and vulnerability, openness, spontaneity, humility, readiness to believe, you know, all of those things. We all know that they're absolutely fantastic qualities, but I think sometimes as, I guess, practitioners, for want of a better word, if you've got volunteers and you've got staff members, sort of trying to retain those qualities can be quite difficult, I guess. And same again with forgiveness. You know, we have Ben who he leads Flint here in the Flint volunteers, and they work to end the demand for sex trafficking, and so they work with the men. and the men who purchase sex, who are essentially perpetuating sex trafficking, and they're, abusing women. And I just honestly, every day, I thank God for Ben, because I'm like, how, and his team, his volunteer team, who spend time offering these guys a completely free, completely confidential, non-judgmental ear, just to listen and listen and listen to what's going on in their life, and try and sort of shift their perspectives on how to treat people and all of these kind of things. And just I'm like the opposite. I'm like just rage, so angry, because I hear the stories about these women and what they're put through by men. And so the forgiveness thing I find so hard, really hard, when it comes to the men. And I think that's completely natural. I'm always working on it, but I think it's always going to be normal if I'm working with the ladies that I'm working with. And I think we can, yeah, I think as sort of the secondary people, I'm not really sure what words to use to describe it, because it's not us who is being violated, we're hearing about it. And so I think it can be harder for us to retain those qualities that you talk about, with letting go of worry, being childlike, and showing forgiveness, compared to the women, who I think do it brilliantly well. And I find it mind-blowing that they are able to sort of demonstrate these three qualities so beautifully and authentically, when so often, I mean, I'll speak for myself, but seeing it and hearing it makes it so difficult for me. And so I guess my question is why do you think it is that these people who continue to experience what I would consider hell on earth, is absolutely awful what they experience, are able to step into kingdom relationships in such an authentic way, when often others whose lives are sort of near enough perfectly fine and are sort of witness to it, I guess, struggle so much?
That is really an enormous question, but
Sorry.
full of brilliant observations there. And that's exactly been my experience. And I think the answer to the first bit of the question is because they have experienced the reality of sin in a way that many of us know sin exists, and we do experience sin, but we never experience sin against ourselves to the degree to which these women are experiencing sin against themselves. I mean, not just themselves, not just being cheated out of something, or swindled, or even attacked, but violated. Their whole body, their identity, their dignity as human persons, their worth, and everything has been violated. So they know what the reality of sin is like. They've been there. And as you say, they've lived in hell on earth. And there's something about being freed from that by God that I think everything else drops away, drops into perspective. And therefore to come out of that is such an extraordinary experience. But I think living with reality, through reality and surviving it, and especially surviving it when there are people around them who are helping them to continue that survival, does produce a sort of childlikeness, and does produce a way in which the ordinary worries of life just drop away. Because what can be, once they've gone through that kind of horror, there's very little horror that's any worse than what they've already experienced. So they've already experienced the worst that the world can offer them, and they're still here, they're still surviving. And their ability to forgive, I mean, sometimes I'm worried about that, because sometimes the forgiveness is, well, there are other people who've had it even worse than I have, and therefore it's easier for me to forgive. I've heard that from people, but actually that's that in some sense is not really facing up to the pain that it's cost them. I think real forgiveness is facing your own pain, your own terror, all that's happened to you, and being able to turn your back on it and say, okay, I know what that was like, and I can forgive. And most women can't at this stage. I mean, it's a much longer process of healing. For me, in my experience, it comes at the end of a long process of healing, not at the beginning. And there's bits of forgiveness going on all the time until we're empowered to do the lot. So I agree with you on saying that it is exemplified in the lives of people who've suffered far more often than in the lives of those of us who suffer a lot less. But I think in terms of the categories themselves, it's what Jesus is saying at that point in the Gospel of Matthew about the qualities that were needed if we're going to be relating to God in a way in the kingdom of God, if we're to understand the kingdom of God properly. So it's really moving us away from sorting everything else out ourselves, thinking that, everything is under our control. And that's what worry is. Worry is that things aren't under our control. And therefore we panic, we get worried and anxious about it. And I'm like that all the time. Anything that slips away from my control, I start to worry because they'll mess it up or something gets screwed up, it won't be done properly and all the rest of it. And those kinds of things are really about one's ego. It's kind of almost overestimating your own importance and your own authority and your own power. And letting go of worry is another way of trusting God in a different kind of level. And just trusting God, it says in the book of Job, I will trust God even if he slays me, even if I die in the process. And that's something that most of us don't get anywhere near. But it is saying that there is meaning and there is power and there is goodness in the whole universe. And I don't always understand it. In fact, I don't usually understand it. But God is there and I will put my trust there. But I think that the kind of, what was the third thing? Childlikeness and the third one you meant. So yeah, the forgiveness we've already dealt. The childlikeness is interesting too, because I think what Jesus is saying there is that we are childlike in our relationship with God. And he stresses this a great deal. We trust God like a child trusts his parents if his parents are trustworthy. We're dependent on God like a baby is dependent on its mother for food and so on. So when we get into that mode of being childlike in our dependence on God and our trust in God and our vulnerability towards God, not trying to hide anything from God, but admitting it and facing it and receiving God's love and affirmation, then that's a mark of our being in the kingdom of God. But elsewhere in the Gospels, he also points out we are to be wise. We're to be wiser and actually understand the reality of sin around us. So we have to do these two things. We're not innocent. We're never called to be innocent. We're called to be childlike, but with wisdom as well. And being wise means that we know the jungle out there. We know how bad it is. We understand what these people go through. And therefore, we don't kind of hide from that. We take our measures. We actually take decisions in the light of that. So it's in that particular passage, Jesus is stressing those things, but you also always have to put them alongside passages where he stresses something else. So being wise, having wisdom is also a calling for Christians. And when we're not asked to be innocent, we're asked to be understanding, to exercise wisdom, and to take care of other people. So they all go together in a kind of bundle. And that's, I think that's Christian living that we know a lot more about.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much. I've got one last question for you. So you're aware of the work that we're doing here at Azalea with all who are impacted by sex trafficking, whether that's women who are surviving it, men who are purchasing sex, or people who are experiencing the impacts of it in the local community. We have an absolutely incredible bunch of frontline volunteers. They, again, are those people that it just blows you away how much they're prepared to sacrifice the time, the resources that they give to be involved because they care so deeply about the men and the women who we walk with at Azalea. What would your encouragement be to people who are in the stages of sort of thinking about volunteering with Azalea?
Jesus talked about building a house or building a building and making sure that you've got the resources that you need to finish it, to do the job. And I think that's where I would start. This is demanding work. And volunteers, as you say, volunteers actually make the world go round, but they also provide, they furnish the gift economy. We talk a lot about the economy, which is people earning money and buying stuff and consuming and all the rest of it. But deep down, the kingdom of God runs on the gift economy. People giving themselves, giving their time, giving their love, giving their energy, giving their care. And were it not for the gift economy, we would all be bankrupt, completely bankrupt. So it's not just in Azalea, it's there everywhere. It's in families, it's in relationships, it's in neighborhoods. But Azalea somehow epitomizes it, because it maximizes all its power and its strength through the gift economy. And the gift economy runs on people's goodness and goodwill and longing to serve God in this area. So I think that being part of the gift economy is a massive calling. It's a really important calling, probably as much a calling as anything else in the world. But you have to make sure that if you're taking part in this particular area, you have the resources to do it. Now, I think, therefore, when Jesus says, make sure that you've got the resources to see it through, he's not saying accumulate the capital that you'll need to be able to pay the bills and all the rest of it. He's saying, make sure that this is what God is putting on your heart, because in the end, our resources are in God. They are in God, the Holy Spirit. He gives us the energy to carry on. He gives us the commitment. So I think that's number one. Recognize that this is costly and that commitment costs, and you need the resources. Number two is face your own need for encouragement, because this can also be very discouraging work. For sometimes every step you get forward, you take two backwards, and then sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes you're running ahead and it's achieving wonderful things, but it's discouraging. And very often, when you've put a whole month's work into something, or a lot of time into a particular relationship, and then that person goes out and does something that's so destructive towards themselves, you think, oh, why couldn't I stop them from doing that? And why did they do that? Why did they self-destruct and all of these kinds of things? And you feel discouraged. Or when people steal from you, when you've given them everything that you could give them anyway, and then they nick your goods and clear off with them. And that's discouraging, because you think, my work is pointless. This is no point in doing this. It's getting us nowhere. That's not true. Simply not true. Being there, being the presence of God in that area, is always giving something, irrespective of what it looks like to you as the discouragements happen. So be prepared to be discouraged, but not to be bowed down by discouragement, and recognize that there's always whatever you're doing, even if it doesn't seem to be working out at any particular point, it's so important to people's lives. And then knowing too that every single life you touch, it's not just yourself, it's God who is touching people through them. And when they want to see love, they see it in you. And when they see it in you, they're actually seeing something of the power of the divinity of the universe, the God who loves them and reaches out to them, irrespective of who they are, what they've done, or what they feel about themselves, or whatever. So I think that's also really important. Always recognize that the significance of what you're doing, that one small encounter with one of these people can be the difference between life and death for a person. It can be the difference between hope and despair for a person. And that's you. You're that person who brings hope rather than despair, who brings energy rather than complete draining, who brings the will to go on rather than give up. And I think that to be that person in this sort of situation is wonderful. It's such an important calling. So I really want to encourage the volunteers who might be thinking of doing this, please start soon, get stuck in, join this happy force of people who know what it's about. And don't be surprised at the sin that you see. Don't be surprised at the weight of destruction and sin, because this is what we're up against. We're fighting not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in high places, spiritual wickedness in high places. These are forces beyond our control. That's why we have to constantly give up worrying and give it back to God. There is evil in the universe. It surrounds us all the time. But when we walk with God, we walk with the Holy Spirit, and we protect other people from that evil just by the love that we give them. So go for it, dear ones. Such an important work for you to do.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elaine. I'm going to wrap up. So I want to make sure that everybody is aware that if they want to explore your writings, then you've got a list of lectures on your website, which is www.elainestorkey.com. And there are videoed lectures that you can find online and on social media. So you can purchase your books, including Meeting God in Matthew and the various others online, I think on Amazon and directly from the publishers. Is that SPCK publishers?
Yes, and there were Christian publishers too, like Eden and other
Yeah.
organizations. Yeah.
Brilliant. So if you want to get hold of any of Elaine's books, they're all online. Elaine, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I'm so grateful that you've been able to make the time at such short notice. And I can't wait for people to hear about you and all these incredible answers to the questions. So thank you so much for meeting with me today and being our patron and just being so supportive. We're so thankful.
Holly, it is a huge privilege for me to be your patron. I mean, I can't say enough about you and the work that you're doing and how privileged I am to actually just be a teeny weeny part of it. And God bless you. And God bless the people that you're serving this Christmas. And I just, hope that they will be drenched in energy from the Holy Spirit and given new hope and new life. And blessings on you in everything you're doing towards that.
Thank you so much, Elaine.